Welcome everyone to Pontus Fathom Press. This is our podcast episode number 33, Pontus Fathom Podcast number 33. And our topic today is Lost Carcosa and the American Night, the Great Experiment, and Neptunian influences from Blake, Baudelaire, and Jim Morrison. So yeah, today we're going to talk basically it's a topic that has its roots in Balsamo's Hermeticism of Hastur, and where we come into the topic is going back to, let's say, Lost Carcosa is a feature in Robert W. Chambers' King in Yellow. It's a fiction that very much influenced H.P. Lovecraft. You know, we love to talk about all things Lovecraftian here. And it's been adopted into the Yog-Sothothery of Lovecraft because it has some very interesting properties that I want to kind of talk to about, and very Neptunian properties. But I also want to talk about the poets of this Neptunian kind of, and when I'm talking about Neptunian, I'm talking about astrological Neptune. But this Neptunian, and for those of you that don't know, Neptunian has to do with everything from spirituality, dreams, addictions, fantasies, things that the eyes don't see, so occulted things. It's very much astrologically a newer planet. It's a modern planet. It's one of the planets we can't see with our eyes. And I'd like to the thread I'm going to have through all of this is how Lovecraft's Carcosa yellow sign myth aligns up very much with the poet's vision of America. And going from Jim Morrison's American Night, we can go back two pathways. Back to the birth of America in what's called the Great Experiment, and talking about what that really means, what that dream and vision was. So we're talking about when a vision becomes real, right? And there's a mad version of that, like the mad world of the poets. And we'll cycle through the way we get to Morrison from the mad poets. We can say we start with William Blake, for example. So we'll talk a little bit about William Blake and how his romanticism and also Man Out of Time begins in a Neptunian fashion of otherworldly and visionary poetry. Let's call it poetry. And then we'll also talk about Baudelaire and Sartre's Baudelaire. Charles Baudelaire, Le Paradis Artificiel, or Le Fleur du Mal, poet, also influencing Morrison, right? So we're going to talk about the poets of the American dream from a sort of the counterculture, but let's also talk about it from the point of view of the American Revolution and who those guys were that started the American experiment, right? So we'll kind of take a tour through all of this. And I think a great place to start with is, let's go back to just this concept of Chambers' yellow sign. Okay, so in the world of Robert W. Chambers, as I mentioned, influencer of H.P. Lovecraft, there's this mythological thing at work, something very mythopoeic at work, right? So in the mythos of Chambers, exists this play called The King in Yellow. And if you listen to the play, The King in Yellow, or if you read it, or if you see it performed, or maybe even if you perform it, you not only do go into madness, because that would be easy, it's just madness. But what that madness is the result of is it kind of opens the veil between the world of Lost Carcosa and the realm of Hastur, who's this sort of form of the King in Yellow. So the King in Yellow is Hastur in his forms as a robed yellow king wearing a mask. And as you transport yourself into this land of Lost Carcosa, so Lost Carcosa appears across the lake, and suddenly you're there. It's sort of the dichotomy between, what's fantasy and what's real starts to break down. It's more attributed to the visions of madness than the visions of dreams, right? So in dreams, Lovecraft has got hypnos or these idea of the dreamlands, like Randolph Carter across the dreamlands. And the dreams, we can understand dreams we wake up from, right? And then there's always the horror aspect of dreams, like the dream you can't wake up from, or a nightmare, something like this. But with Hastur, it's a quite different modality. With Hastur's yellow sign, he is, and you think of Lovecraft's Cthulhu is sleeping. So Cthulhu kind of has this idea of a dreamer, a dreaming dead beneath the ocean in his sunken city of Rilya, right? Waiting for it to rise. And, he's also able to contact the other dreamers in the fleshy mammalian mind. He sends his dreams out, right? But with Lost Carcosa, Chambers does this great thing where the madness is just the gateway. So in the world you might seem mad, but in the land of Carcosa, you're part of the court of this king in yellow once you've seen the yellow sign. So there's kind of like this, I want to call it a counterculture aspect to it. It's a superimposed with madness, and it's got all of its tropes from a world building point of view. But from a fictional point of view, I thought it was very interesting because all of these things resonate with this astrological Neptune. And I kind of wanted to go back through that sort of like this genealogy of those poets that go from Blake to Baudelaire to Morrison. And it could have been even Nick Cave could be in this. This could be a Nick Cave story, but maybe that's one we'll do another time, right? But if we go through this, if we go through the story of Blake and the story of Baudelaire and the story of Morrison, just in the small context, and then we look at that also as that American great experiment. And when we talk about the great experiment, you're going to see that a lot of these authors looked at their lives as kind of an experiment. Okay, so when we think about those who would take the colonial America, the pre-American colonies, and do an experiment to see what would happen if we make the world, if we become free. And this is where that patriot movement came out of that. And I think it's very interesting to distinguish that. We're going to talk about the Tories and the patriots and how the traditionalists were the Tories in that day. They're like, why rock the boat? We don't drink tea. Who cares if they tax it? Like there's this sort of a traditionalist group there. And then you have this counterculture group. So in a way, these days, it seems if you say patriot, it sounds like the Patriot Act, sounds like a Republican thing. But back then, the Patriot was actually the Liberty Party, which was the party of, let's see what happens if we create an experiment where the principle is humans are free, right? And I think no one better resonates that than some of these artists who are, and I want to say it in two levels, the artist of freedom to express oneself in an experiment with one's life, but also the vision that comes with what it takes to be the kind of people, and I think all these examples are great, that are kind of, to put it in a weird way, they kind of have seen a sort of yellow sign, right? So just like in the Hastur story, you see the yellow sign, and then suddenly you could be seen by some as mad, right? You can look to the hippie movement of Morrison. It's like, oh, this is crazy, or the debauchery of Baudelaire, or just the out of sync with his time mythologies of Blake. These poetic visions that set these people apart when they're out of time, and then you bring it back to the idea of what's going on in the real world, and you see that the ability to create becomes so amazing. And this is what the inspiration of the Neptunian creation. You need to have dreamers, let's say, or visionaries, right? And this is where we have to be real careful about how we stifle things and how that works. So let's dive right into it with some examples. I think I've got some good examples for you guys here today. So first one is I think we'll start out with Blake. And Blake's, I've got this edition of Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And in a way, Blake was influence of even Morrison. I got this book called My Business is to Create, Blake's Infinite Writing. And just this one paragraph that I thought was kind of tying us into the Morrison's topic. And it says, a true Blakean experience, we're talking about epiphanies. These epiphanies, and it says, well, actually it says related to a substance kind of epiphany. It says, in true Blakean experience, he understood it doesn't involve dreamy fantasies of heavenly delights, but intense perceptions cleansed of prefabricated ideas. And okay, we kind of talked a bit about this prefabricated ideas concept back when we did the necromancy of Nyarlathotep talk, right? We were talking about Saturn in the past couple podcasts, and you guys can go back and watch those, but we were sort of talking about how Saturnian energy, in a Steiner view and also astrological view, let's say, has to do with time, karma, where we came from. Like, we look back at history and we try to have that, even if it's our personal history. But if we keep looking past history, we start to get to the realm where people that are no longer alive were the custodians of that history. And now you can see where we have these, let's say, confusions of where are the limits. Life is the current people that are the fruits of history, in a way. But when we turn our gaze back to history, we get a deep insight into how we got where we are. And that's Saturnian. Neptunian is totally turned in the other direction. Neptunian is an outward looking, and it's characterized here. It says, a person who doesn't involve in dreamy fantasies of heavenly delights, cleansed of prefabricated ideas, right? So if I talk about Saturn as looking back at history and trying to find these deep origins, you could also say that this Saturnian thing is cleansed of any religion. Like, there's lots of religions that have mentioned this. There's religions that move past it. But the idea of it is trying to get to that pure experience is something Blake was doing. He duly titled his little essay, The Doors of Perception, drawing from Blake's lines. This is about Huxley. He titled his essay, The Doors of Perception, drawing from Blake's lines about the connection between electrified sensuality and spiritual revelations. And then they say, Blake inspired exploration of human potential. We see the emergence of The Doors, Jim Morrison's apocalyptic rock band, desperate to break on through to the other side, that took its name from Huxley's book, right? So you sort of see Blake didn't require the sublimely rugged vistas of the American Pacific, or Dionysian rock rhythms, or dissolved grams of cactus flowers to facilitate his vision. He needed only his remarkably clear eyes, artist eyes, and his passion for burning away the surfaces to reach the infinite inwardness with boundless ongoing. With these enkindled optics, Blake could discern distinction and unities unseen by most. Right? So here we get a great little introduction of both Blake and the influence of Morrison. But I wanted to take you to this passage here in Blake's. Now, Blake would make these illuminated manuscripts. If you see his style, he would draw these almost like it was a monk creating an illuminated manuscript, but he would write his poems and publish them himself. So here he is. He's kind of like, think of him almost like an early blogger or an early YouTuber these days, right? YouTubers can create content, but back then he just would sort of craft these visions in his. So we've got this one plate in here. One of his poems here is called "The Voice of the Devil," and it says, "All Bibles or sacred codes have been the cause of the following errors: that man has two real existing principles, body and soul; that energy called evil is from the body, and the following contradictions are also true: man has no body distinct from his soul; energy is the only life as from the body, and reason is the bound or outward circumference of energy, and energy is eternally delight. Those who restrain desire," he says, "do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained, and the restrainer or reason usurps its place and governs the unwilling, and being unrestrained and by degrees passive, till it is only the shadow of desire. And history is thus written in Paradise Lost," and this is talking about Milton, "the original archangel or professor of the command of the heavenly host is called the devil or Satan. His children are called sin and death. But in the book of Job, Milton's Messiah is called Satan. For his histories have been adopted by both parties. It has indeed appeared to reason as if desire was cast out. But the devil's account is that the Messiah fell and formed a heaven of what he stole from the abyss. This is shown in the gospel, for he prays to the Father to send the Comforter, or desire that reason may have idea to build on. But in Milton, the Father is destiny, the Son a ratio of the five senses, and the Holy Ghost a vacuum. The reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote the angels and God, and at liberty when he wrote of the devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. Now, this is something that's great. Like, he's talking about Milton here, right? So William Blake is talking about Milton writes Paradise Lost, and as people may know, Milton's Paradise Lost is rather serve in hell than rule in hell and serve in heaven. But what ends up happening is Milton, who was very religious and wanted to show the devil as diabolical and how God's grace was the right way, he ended up making this kind of anti-hero out of the devil, because the devil suddenly becomes defiant and revolutionary, right? So here we go. Here we are on the path. Now you can see some connection here. So Blake's has these revolutionary ideas of reason versus desire, and he pours it into these pages, and it's the work of a poet, right? And the poet who's reinterpreting the world, right? So now reinterpreting the world will come back when we get to the American story, the great experiment. But one's life as experimental, I think, is interesting here. There's also a quick note about that where it says, in Milton, Blake described three classes of people: the elect, the reprobate, and the redeemed. The elect are exemplified by Satan. They believe the universe is static and systems of laws that fully determine what a creature can be. This is the cosmos of Newton and the hardcore Calvinist conviction that the souls are predestined or saved. Blake suggests that this deadening worldview was prevalent in his time, bolstering the tyrannical king who wants complicit subjects and the supporting Orthodox clergyman desiring the sanctioning of his blessedness. There is no place for the artist in this kind of satanic domain. The secular and regular rulers fear the power of art to inspire the populace to question the status quo, to imagine a democracy, to create forms conducive to equality. And so the king and priest demonize the poets, and they exile them to the outskirts, thus the reprobate. And this was what Blake would call rintra. Rintra, he created his own, Blake created his own cosmology, so to speak, right? So anyway, that's a little bit on Blake. Blake's the devil isn't, in Blake's the devil isn't the one we think he is. The devil's the one that tricked us into believing in the status quo, kind of, right? This is an odd devil, right? Like, he tricked us to think, oh, just keep on the program, right? Something like this. And, just pay the tax and just keep on the program. And and we'll see a similar thing with Baudelaire. I think we move to the Baudelaire story. Again, another Blakean influence. I think right here it starts out, and we know Baudelaire, most famous for maybe his Flowers of Evil, the Fleur du Mal. But this one is called the Paradise Artificial. So the artificial paradise, it's not the meta. He's talking about the world of intoxication, right, from substances, right? And so here he's talking about the Hashishen, or the assassins, right? The Hashishen, the assassins, they take their name, as you can tell the sound of it, right? Assassin, Hashishen, right? And he's talking about the consumption of the indica, plants that are used to get to other states, the history of this, mental states, right? So that the poetic inspiration kind of has this kind of, Baudelaire has got this reputation, I'd say, of the, everywhere from the man out of the shadows, the opium addict, dandy, frigid disciple of desire, and the greatest lyric poet of the age. In his writings, we can see the lunar landscape of his distressed soul. So we see Baudelaire as the anguished intelligence selecting and arranging his own evil destiny, juggling the values of the world at the turning point of modern times. So you got to see that Baudelaire is sort of positioned in this time where he's looking against the grain of things working out, right? So I just footnoted this. You asked me for a poem for your little book. I suppose you mean a poem about nature, don't you? About the woods, the great oaks, the verdure, the insects, and probably the sun. But you know perfectly well that I am incapable of getting worked up over plants. and that my whole soul rebels against this particular new religion, which to my mind will always have something inexpressibly shocking about it for every spiritual being. I shall never believe that the soul of the God inhabits plant life. And even if it did, I shouldn't worry much about it. I should consider my own soul far more valuable than the soul of the sanctified vegetable. Now here he is. It's kind of like, what's he on about, right? He has a contempt for the insignificance of the vegetable world, right? But I think in another way. Here's another one. Here's another quote, potentially, Baudelaire saying, I find unenclosed water intolerable. I like to see it imprisoned in a yoke between the geometrical walls of the pool, right? So the idea of this is like, there's a kind of a strange vision at work here. There's a strange vision at work where it has to do with control, right? The idea of the poet's dream here is to say, oh, if I am going to be thought of as the animal as opposed to as the human, then it's sort of like you're closing off to me some of those spaces, or you're binding me to some spaces. And it has a colonialist kind of talk to it, right? And I want to bring up the analogy, because it comes up right here, but when we get to the American Revolution topic of this, it's the idea that, oddly enough, during colonial times in America, Americans were, the colonies were able to access and produce the huge bounty of American natural resources. There were forests to cut down, there was tobacco to grow, there was all kinds of natural products. And the original colonies were more and more regulated not to be manufacturing people, but to be just the suppliers of raw materials to England, where the manufacturing would take place there, and the markup, right? So the value would be put in England, and that would keep Americans at that time, colonial times, pre-revolution times. So this is one of those things. I think there's a resonance here between Baudelaire and this concept of like the Tory mentality, which is, hey, keep on keeping on, status quo. The American Tory mentality was more like, hey, well, we're just a colony. Why don't we just follow the rules? What's wrong, everyone? Why are we following the rules? And then there was this sort of spirit of liberty saying, hey, well, we're Americans. Why can't we do some manufacturing? Just because the king has said we can't, right? And then you sort of see that this is that, again, now you have the artist spirit of interpreting. What Baudelaire's doing is he's looking to the escape, the Neptunian escape, and then looking back at the real world and sort of calling on its ironies, right? The ironies of the world. And by pointing us to some scary parts, some nightmarish aspects of that, right? Like the yellow sign of these nightmarish aspects of the status quo, we start to peer through a different veil, right? We're starting to peer through a different veil. Through the eyes of the artist, Blake, we have this idea of, well, the devil that tells you not to like to do things, that might be the real devil, right? As opposed to the one religion and the state has been telling you about. And Baudelaire kind of does a similar thing here, right? I think Baudelaire does a similar thing when he's talking about the underbelly, right? And this is the world from his experiences as kind of a dandy and an addict, right? He would kind of go through this. But this is, again, it's framed in a certain time. I think when we move forward into the sort of influences of Jim Morrison and the Doors, I want to go to, now this is a highly controversial, let's say, but it's a standard old rock biography of Jim Morrison. But there's an interesting forward here that kind of ties some of this together. It says, well, Morrison's quote at the beginning said, let's just say I was testing the bounds of reality. I was curious to see what would happen. That's all it was, just curiosity. And then it says, it quotes here, it says, though the favorites of the gods die young, they also live eternally in the company of gods. And there's a call out quickly here to Artaud and Blake that I want to sort of reference. I think maybe it's best in the back here. There's a quote here from the afterwards. It said, the poet Blake said, "The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom." And Jim Morrison understood that, and he was excessive. Either poets arrive at wisdom because they are in fact poets, or they never get there because they're divine fools. Another proverb from Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell states, "Prudence is a rich old maid courted by incapacity." So again, we're going back to the prudence of the Tories. We'll read about the Tories in a second. Versus, hey, just keep on keeping on. Follow the status quo. Why are you rocking the boat? And then you have this other urge to create, right? Jim was not prudent, and it follows that he seldom knew incapacity. Jim was a metamorphic hero. And he perceived with his senses that he altered with substances, like the sacred Dionysus and the god of drama and intoxication. Jim was one of the brightest spirits, the author says, he's ever known. And I think that this is kind of like that Blakean time and that Blakean mode of poets kind of gets evoked here, right? So what are we talking about, American Night now? So, I think Jim Morrison had these great poems. I think I called one out here. It said, from the poem, I think it's from the American Night. He says, and it kind of relates us right back to the Yellow Mythos, right? So we have in here the American Night. We have some writings that are sort of, the American Prayer is in here. And Blake I think Blake also wrote a poem to America. So there's a number of poems to America. And it's sort of like, let's start with the 60s counterculture view back to the revolution, because it's a different revolution happening, right? In the 60s counterculture, that revolution was sort of against a 1950s post-war establishment, right? So there was sort of, this is a recurrent theme throughout all of these times, right? Whether it's Baudelaire's brothels or Morrison's hippie scene, right? Something like this. There was a counterculture at that time, 1960s. But there's a kind of a mention somewhat of insanity, or that madness of poets, the Dionysian madness of poets, which I believe gets us into that Neptunian space, right? So just this one I read that was pretty good. It said, "Wake up, you can't remember where it was. Has this dream stopped?" he says. And then he says, "Once I had a little game. I like to crawl back into my brain. I think you know the game I mean. I mean the game called Go Insane. Now you should try this little game. Just close your eyes, forget your name, forget the world, forget the people, and we'll erect a different steeple. This little game is fun to do. Just close your eyes. No way to lose. And I'm right there. I'm going too. Release control. We're breaking through. Burrow back into the brain, way back past the realm of pain, back to where there's never rain, and the rains falls gently on the town, and over the heads of all of us, and in the labyrinths of streams, beneath the quiet unearthly presence of nervous hill dwellers in the gentle hill around, reptiles abound, fossils, caves, cool air heights. Each house repeats a mold, windows rolled, beast car locked in against morning, and now sleeping, rugs silent, mirrors vacant, dust blind under the beds of lawful couples wound in sheets and daughters smug. Wait, there's been a slaughter here. Don't stop and speak or look around. Your gloves and fan are on the ground. We're getting out of town. We're going on the run. And you're the one I want to come, not to touch the earth, not to see the sun, nothing left to do but run, run, run. Let's run. Right, so the idea here is you get all of that American mythology, you get that James Dean mythology, and all of that kind of comes on, hey, it's almost like a status check. The 1960s were a status check on that original American Revolution great experiment, because now we have another counterculture, right? It was the Kennedy years, right? Kennedy was thinking about, hey, yeah, we have kind of done, like, Blake said, really, are the traditional structures what's keeping the people down? What if we had more of I think this is those older Democrat values of the Kennedy era, which is why people still revere his presidency. These older generations that from that time, they really revere Kennedy still. And I think if you look to that Kennedy time, this is what made his death so tragic, right? And the young death of all these tragic poets, right? Morrison, young death, Kennedy, young death, right? So we think about those hero sacrifices and sort of part of that American story, right? And I think if we go back to, this is actually in my American history book from grade school, but there's an interesting thing here about the Tories. So, we have that context of the American Revolution. You have American colonies, and you have the idea of, here's a picture of a Tory. A loyalist unaware that someone has placed a Tory sign on his back is subjugated to mild community ridicule. In many instances, however, community antagonism between patriots and Tories ran deep and violent. Right, so the idea here is we were at the point where the status quo party of the Tories and where the status quo party of the Tories was kind of like, is there really a problem here? I mean, what's the issue? And I think that what was interesting though is as the Patriot movement came up, and that Patriot movement was kind of like the counterculture movement. That was the one that said, hey, we're going to come up with this new idea, universal rights of men. And they're willing to put their money where their mouth was, right? So there was it said other patriots contended that they were not advocating real change in government, but were simply protecting the political restrictions imposed upon them following the French and Indian War. At the beginning, only a few colonists advocated independence. Most wanted only to correct British injustices, and accepted independence only after attempts to compromise with England seemed to have failed. So this is a typical colonial story, right? They want to they're happy to be a colony. Can we just fix some injustices with our colonial status? However, the motivation for the majority of the rank and file patriots was not difficult to explain. As the following interview with a 91-year-old veteran of the Battle of Concord reveals. So this is a 91-year-old veteran of the Battle of Concord says, "Do you take up arms against intolerable oppression?" The interviewer asked. "Did you take up arms against intolerable oppressions?" The interviewer asked. So oppressions here is talking about the Declaration of Independence. "Oppressions," replied the old man, "I didn't feel them." "Were you not oppressed by the Stamp Act?" And he goes, "I never saw one of those stamps. I certainly never paid a penny for one." "Well, what about the tea tax? I mean, you never drank a drop of the stuff. The boys threw it all overboard." "Then I suppose you had been reading Harrigan or Sidney or Locke about the eternal principles of liberty." "I never heard of them. We only read the Bible, the Catechism, Watts's Psalms and hymns, and the Almanac." "Well, then, what was the matter? And what did you mean in going to the fight?" He goes, "Young man, what we meant in going for those redcoats was this. We always had governed ourselves, and we were always meant to. That didn't mean we should. They didn't mean we should." The belief in natural rights, however, did not influence many of the Patriot spokesmen. Among their natural rights, identified by the 17th century political theory John Locke, were the rights of life, liberty, and property. So the Patriots really were these people like John Locke, like even James Otis, right? We see James Otis here. It's a great quote. It says, James Otis was one of the first American spokesmen for the separation of powers in government, right? Otis's most popular contribution to the Patriot cause was his opposition to the writs of assistance. "One of the most essential branches of liberty is the freedom of one's house. A man's house is his castle. So opposed was he to the principle of unauthorized search and seizure of private property that he resigned his higher paid position as King's advocate in order to be able to plead the case of 60 Boston merchants, like a prosecuting attorney. I am determined to my dying day to oppose with all my powers all such instruments of slavery. I argue in the favor of British liberties." So, we have this allusion to slavery and a slave system, right? So the idea here is, what was the American Revolution kind of about? It was kind of about the keeping a level of control on a colonial population, right? Let's call it a colonial social group, right? Or we can even call it we talk about on social media these days building a community, right? But the community is contained within a platform, right? And the platform of England, of the King of England at that time, that platform was, well, they're a raw material provider. We can tax them. On top of preventing them from producing things, they taxed them and just kept increasing the tax. So they're giving away natural resources. They aren't able to make the middleman value from that by law. And then they were taxed. And then on top of that, they were able to be searched and search and seizure by troops that were occupying. So at some point, you see this is the erosion of liberties that leads to this patriot movement. And the Tories were kind of like, well, it's just a tax. I mean, sometimes there's a check stop. Sometimes you've got to do this like control mechanism. Now, how does this all come back to Hastur, Lost Carcosa, and the Yellow Sun? Well, what's interesting about the Neptune reference, right? So we have here Bensimagos' Moons of the Planets. And in the Neptune reference, we have this call out to like a mysticism, but also a higher octave planet, right? Because the idea here is when one is looking at the world in history, one just can look back. The Saturn was the last planet of the visible solar system, and it was also in ancient times, astrologically, it was the last planet, and it was a planet of karma. It's the planet of karma. It's the planet of time, aging, history. So with Saturn, whenever we're reflecting on history, we look back to the American Revolution. We look back to Kennedy, right? We're reflecting back through the lives of people and the remnants they've left for us through their works and the structure of the world in some cases, right? When we look past Saturn to these modern planets astrologically, like Neptune, we're no longer to see Neptune with our eyes. We can see Saturn with the naked eye. I've seen it in the telescope before. Visibly, you can see the ring of Saturn with a very inexpensive telescope. So it's amazing. Like, this is something we've been doing since Galileo's time, right? Maybe even longer. I believe Galileo might have seen through telescope something that he misidentified as a star, but it was actually Neptune. So I think you guys can fact check me on that one. But anyway, the idea of Neptune in astrology has to do with the things that are unseen. So we talked about in one of our Steiner talks about his concept of fourth dimensional looking, where you see the light within. Now, all of this sounds very much like poet talks, right? The fourth dimension, light within. Well, this is how poets think, right? This is the tradition from Blake, right? The tradition from Blake, the tradition of Baudelaire, the tradition of Morrison. But I want to say that even our social thinkers, there's something, okay, it could be annoying sometimes. There's something about veganism. Okay, there's something powerful there, right? Maybe there's a movement there. Maybe it's just attuning to some need that the greater world has, and that these sensitive poets are able to sort of latch onto it sooner. But I think the minority of, let's say, those patriot movement people, let's think of a Benjamin Franklin even, right? They had it. You could say, from a Tory point of view, it was a mad vision, right? So Neptune has a positive and negative aspect to it, where Neptunian visions could be the drug-induced ravings of madmen, or they can be kind of an art that influences us. So we go back to Lovecraft's world. Lovecraft wanted to play with this trope, though. Right? Lovecraft wanted to play with it, very much so the way Baudelaire would say. Blake flips the devil. He says, maybe the devil was just the thing that made you ashamed of loving things. And Baudelaire would say, oh, well, really? You want to see how beautiful nature is? You're like, well, let's go look into the dark corners of it. Let's go look into the brothels. Let's see can we make that noble? And he just always had a kind of an irony to him. He had a kind of a venom to him, but also kind of a mad vision that he had to get out, right? And I think that Morrison also talks about an American prayer. He talks about these tropes of being on the road. He's in a rock band, right? He talks about the American night, which is sort of like this apocalyptic idea of things falling apart, He talks about in the American night, he has one thing. He says, he talks about the hitchhiker, right? Goes, the mansion is warm at the top of the hill. Rich are the rooms and the comforts there. Red are the arms of luxuriant chairs, and you won't know a thing till you get inside. Then he says, dead president's corpse in the driver's car. The engine runs on glue and tar. Come on along. We're not going very far. To the east to meet the Tsar. Some outlaws lived on the side of a lake. The minister daughters in love with the snake. Who lives in a well by the side of the road. Wake up, girl, we're almost home. Sun, 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 burn, burn, burn. Soon, soon, soon. Moon, moon, moon. I'll get you soon, soon, soon. Right? Back to Blake's Devil, maybe. Right? We've got the Kennedy reference in there. Right? So the idea here is that the poet is able to, in a mad way, place us quickly into some interesting, political, philosophical moments that's different than the way that traditional government works or the priesthood works. Right? The priesthood tries to align you to a religious practice. Government tries to regulate the populace. But the poet's doing a totally different action. Right? Poet's doing a different action here. And what we have what's great about Lovecraft and Chambers' kind of King in Yellow cycle, let's call it, is the idea here is it only looks like madness on the outside. Because actually the King in Yellow, it doesn't seem like a mad, blurry castle across the Lake Hali, right? It's not just blurred, lost Carcosa. It's actually somewhere else that's almost, there's one writer that described it as perhaps it's a forgotten dream of some alien world, right? So maybe there's like a way that someone else's dreamlands and they're no longer around, and those dreams live on. And Hastur, in his defiance to dreaming, says, no, I'm going to keep this alive out here through the portal, let's call it, through the portal of the yellow sign. And so Hastur becomes it's a great world building technique, right? But Hastur becomes this sort of mad, Cthulhu-like king, but he's not a Cthulhu-like guy because it's not a dream thing. He forces you across, but then the more you believe it, the more that the Lost Carcosa goes from a ruined city in the fog to being more like a masked ballroom party, right? It's like a masked ballroom party in which participants and celebrants are following the structure of Hastur, who appears for the moment as the tattered King in Yellow, but at some point the tatters turn to a different form, right? And the tentacles go back, and maybe he just seems, and this is like the Nyarlathotep kind of trope is in here too, right? That crawling chaos comes from here. And obviously there is some deeper relation back to Azathoth and alchemy, and we'll talk about that one in a later one. But I think this might be a good place to stop it. I mean, so what do you guys think? Neptunian influences in Jim Morrison, End of America, or the Apocalypse of America through the poet's eye, linking back to the Great Experiment. Maybe the wrap-up topic here is, the Great Experiment has to allow for the freedoms from this kind of colonial control, colonization. And more we see evidences towards systems that don't want the poet's voice to be always heard. Now listen, we live in a pretty open time in the sense of internet is there. You have some platforms that are doing some banning. I definitely suggest you guys to go check out our links below. We've got another channel that we do some board gaming on. We've also got a website. If you could check out our bookstore, you can find the books linked here for sale there. And it helps us to support and grow the channel, so really appreciate that. But getting back to that kind of systems of control, I've also diversified off of YouTube to some other platforms as well. And I've gotten back on Twitter because this Elon Musk thing I think is kind of interesting, right? It's very interesting how these social spaces evolve and change over time. And I think that for the Great Experiment to keep going, we still need to allow creators to create spaces in which people get to explore ideas and are open to the idea that in societies that are built out of this post-Enlightenment thinking, that we're able to, politely pivot to a place where even people who disagree can sort of have a forum to talk together. And in some ways, I've just sort of diversified and put myself on Odyssey and Rumble and BitChute as well, just in case something happens. All this, I don't want all the work to disappear. The other thing, just to make a quick announcement, I've got a surprise coming out. I've been working hard with the podcast and reviewing some of the past topics we've done and preparing for the next past 33. And one of the things that came is maybe they might do a podcast series of books. So I'm looking at the work, editing them down. If you guys are interested, stay tuned here. You can like and subscribe if you like what we're doing here. We're trying to get up to 1,000 subscribers, so really appreciate you guys doing that. And thanks for letting me have the sales pitch in the middle of this. But I think that this idea of being open to creativity, sharing some of these ideas, definitely like your guys' comments below. I read all the comments, and at some point I'd like to make this a live stream. So if we could get to 1,000, love that. Check out the bookstore, check out the links below. We've got a Patreon too, so appreciate your patronage and your attention. If you like what we did here, leave a like and a comment. If not, thank you for your time, and I'll see everyone on our next podcast with some new updates and some new news. This has been Lost Carcosa and the American Night, The Great Experiment, Neptunian influences from Blake, Baudelaire, and Morrison. I thank you all. Good night.